This is Pop Culture Confidential, and I'm Christina Yerling Biru. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. If there's one thing movies can't escape this year, it's parents. Parental guilt, loss, and regret. We're seeing it in films like Sentimental Value, Hamnet, and Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another, as well as in genre hits like Weapons and 28 Years Later. The theme is everywhere. Is it just a coincidence, or is there something in the cinematic waters? Are we seeing a generational shift from filmmakers reckoning with their own parents to now reckoning with themselves as parents? Or are we in a moment thinking about parenting in this uncertain world? Anyway, so many different takes and theories to dive into. I'm so glad to be joined by critic Jorge, also known as J. Don Birnam, to untangle fathers, mothers, and families on screen this season. Hey Jorge, welcome back. So nice to see you again.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
So we're film lovers, we're parents, we're professionals. We have like tissues in one hand, popcorn in the other this season, right?
Always, but a lot more this time.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've been seeing. All these films, and I didn't even mention some of them, Jay Kelly and stuff. We'll get into that. Before we start into some in particular, do you have a theory as to kind of what's going on?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this, and I think you mentioned what my theory is of the options that you gave. I think my theory is the shift from movies and filmmakers dealing with their parents and now dealing with themselves as parents. The theme of parenthood and fatherhood in particular is an old one in movies, right? And I think perhaps the most classic example, I think in all of movie history is I Am Your Father, right? Like that's the classic, that's the big reveal, that's like shocking, that line is iconic, and that sort of twist is one of the most memorable in the history of film, and that's from the 80s. And obviously George Lucas is a little bit older than some of the filmmakers we're going to discuss today. But when you think about that, and there's a bunch of those examples in the 80s where John Hughes and Chris Columbus and others are making these movies about children and how they sort of see their fathers and their mothers, but their parents. And now it's what you said. I think it's now we're transitioning to the filmmakers that are sort of in charge now, right? The great American, but also non-American filmmakers. They're in their 50s, maybe 60s, and they're starting to wonder, was I a good parent? Have I been a good parent? And then there's this anxiety that they were not, right? And they're and sort of looking back on what they did right or wrong. So I think it's that. I think it's that. I think it's that aging of the movie making population into from looking at their parents to looking at themselves as parents. That's my theory, but of course there will be examples and counterexamples.
It's so interesting because I have that feeling as well. And in a way, I mean, we're not going to go too much into analysis, but it feels like our generation, we are more sort of into how we are as parents than our parents were. You know what I mean? So that generation of filmmakers may be more interested in looking at their own parents, while we're all full of guilt as to our own as our own
That's a
roles
really
as
good
parents.
point, right? That's a really good point where, yeah, where sort of then there's a shift, right? Because there's the concept of helicopter parenting, and there's like sort of the
Exactly.
80s, 90s version of parenting that maybe we were brought up with, but people are re-examining that as they re-examine everything. And so they're saying, well, is that the right way to do it? And some of these people might have even been caught in a transition where they're like, well, we did it this way because that's what we were told to do in the 90s. But now in the 2020s, people are like, maybe you shouldn't have done it that way. And so they're like, oh, crap. Like, did I, there's that anxiety. And then there's just, as you say, we're parents, and there's just the regular old day-to-day anxiety of, am I screwing up this child?
Exactly.
Like,
And how have I done
so
that? And as
yeah.
so talking about some of the movies we've seen in 2025, I've tried to split them up between some different categories, and include anything you want in here, but I thought we'd start talking about the fathers. And I have a few I want to mention. Jay Kelly, Sorrentino's movie, PTA,
Mhm.
Sentimental Value, 28 Years Later. Those are a few of them. Do you want to start talking about Jay Kelly, for example?
Yeah, so just, very generally, right, without like spoiling too much, right? Jay Kelly's Noah Baumbach's Netflix movie, I believe.
Hmm.
And George Clooney is the title character, Jake Kelly, and he's like it's like a super successful movie star, right? He's him, but even more like and essentially he's about to become an empty nester. His youngest daughter is about to leave, and they have a complicated relationship, mostly because he was an absentee father, right? Absenteeism is there. That's one of the many ways in which you could presumably screw up your kids. And so, and one that I certainly, as a working professional, sometimes fear a lot, like, okay, I'm not going to be there, and then they're going to resent me, and not just resent me, but it's going to create this like difficult relationship. So that's that movie. That's the sort of setup. And, it's a little hard to talk too much about it without spoiling what happens. But I think what's going on in that movie is that he's sort of just allowing himself to maybe forgive himself for that, while recognizing that it did cause some, less than ideal uh, elements in the relationship between the father and the daughters, but more than anything, the regret that he has for having missed those moments and the realization that maybe, there was a little bit of selfishness there. And I think that what that theme is sort of interacting with is, to bring it back to the real world, as you, I think, so correctly point out. I think in modern parenting theories, I'm not an expert, but as a dad and like reading things, a lot of times people will say, "Well, you got to take care of yourself so that you have to be okay so that your kids can be okay." That makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you haven't slept enough, like you can't take care. Like I get it. So that all makes sense, and I think Baumbach is like sort of struggling with that a little bit because I think he's questioning, he's asking how much do you need to take care of yourself for, right? So Jay Kelly's personal drive and ambitions were to be this mega successful movie star, a creative person, and that's all valuable in the world. But I think Baumbach is maybe questioning that sort of concept of take care of yourself first a little bit and saying anything taken to the extreme can be toxic, right? So
Hmm.
you could say, well, I'm going to take care of myself, and that just means I'm just going to do whatever I want until I'm done, right? And so I think that's what Jake Kelly is sort of trying to push a little bit the limit on. And we're going to talk about other movies that are sort of coming at it from the entire opposite direction, where they say, no, you really, really need to take care of yourself. Like if you don't do that enough, you're not going to be a good father or mother. There's one that I have in mind. So that I think that's what Jake Kelly's about, right? He's sort of pushing back on the notion that just doing essentially whatever you need to do to make yourself happy is the way to be a good father. I think that's what that.
That's well said. I think that's so interesting. And I would like to add here a sentimental value because Jay Kelly also has the element of this being someone in the arts, right? Which sentimental value also has, where Stellan Skarsgård plays the director who also has been the absentee father. He has two daughters and he's trying to reconnect to them, particularly to one who's an actress played by Renate Rensve, who he introduces a script to that he wants her to play. And here you have the same kind of, in many ways, issues as Jay Kelly, but it's interesting that both of them have to do with fathers in the arts. And I'm wondering if the directors themselves of these two movies, as well as possibly Paul Thomas Anderson, who's reckoning with his fatherhood in One Battle After Another, although it's not about the arts. A lot of these movies feel kind of like it's the director speaking through them. Would you agree?
Totally, totally. I mean, there's that. I think that's another trend in modern art in general, to take a step back. Like if you look at literature, I think a lot of modern art is very, very autobiographical. Of course, everything has tints of autobiographical, and we'll talk about this a little more too with One Battle. I think whereas before, a lot of art, say, for example, in the 70s or Star Wars, like picking up on that, was a lot of societal commentary. Like, this is what I observe is happening. It's become very introspective. And so it's absolutely, it has to be some form of autobiography. I don't know. I mean, there's a house in the Sentimental Value that's sort of a motif. Um, and the director told me at Telluride that he just had a similar experience with his own childhood home. I won't say what the experience is, but whatever the experience is in the movie. So that confirms the autobiographical nature. Now, I don't know his biography.
Joachim Trier is a third generation filmmaker.
Yeah.
So
So
a lot of those things, I think. And he just had children between these two last movies. So that has impacted how the script for this one.
right. And so that's what I thought was interesting about that one, right? Because his children are younger, right? In the movie, as you described, Stellan is an older man, also very successful producer, successful, I guess, director. his daughters are also older, right? They're in their 20s at least. And so it's interesting because there's clearly an autobiographical element for Trier, but he hasn't gone through that life of raising his girls. And so I don't know if he's talking a little bit about his own father. I don't know enough about his biography, or if it's simply he's, future casting his
That's what
anxieties
I think it
about.
is. He's
Yeah.
worried about that ambition and art and parenthood. How do you combine
Balance
those
it.
things? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. How do you balance it? And so that's where I think the movie has a very similar theme to Jay Kelly, because as I said, I think Jay Kelly's about like questioning whether that balance is, and I think sentimental value is recognizing that it is, it's hard, it sucks to say it this way, but it's kind of a zero-sum game, right? There's 24 hours in the day, there's 7 days in the week, and any extra hour you play with your child, it might be an hour that you're not writing a project or working on one, and that might keep you from your true potential. Jay Kelly chose maximum, almost essentially maximum, professional development. Skarsgård's character is a little complicated because, as you say, he's trying to give something to her, like a project. He's thinking about her. They also separated. I mean, this is very early in the movie, right? So they separated, and unlike One Battle After Another, where it's the single father taking care of the daughter, here it's like the father's gone and they're raised by the mom, right? So they're almost a stranger to him, in the way that they talk about him. One of them has a really, really, I would say, not just complicated, but pretty negative relationship with him. The other one's a little more forgiving. And he's, Triers is picking pieces from experience somewhere. And I think he's very cleverly describing what that looks like in the real world, in that when you have a situation like that where the father's absent, it's going to be very frequently the case that one of the kids might be more loving and forgiving of it and misses him, and the other one is like rejecting him, right? What's interesting is that this also plays out through several generations, because there's a lot of flashbacks to what happened in their family. And so I think Trier is almost telling you that these are sort of inevitable, and that we're sort of trapped into these patterns and cycles, and that it might not be, you can resist it only so much, but these are just sort of like the intergenerational harms that we inflict upon each other, because this had to come from a lot of what Stellan Skarsgård's character was doing was coming from what had happened to his own mother, and going back. So I think in Trier's view, there's a little bit of a sort of inevitability to how generations treat each other and ultimately harm, but also love each other. So that's, I think, his perspective. And I think it's also really amazing, beautiful, and sad one to some degree.
True, true. And how we are sort of assigned roles, either in our family, depending on that generational trauma you're talking about, or sibling we are in. Before I want to talk more about Paul Thomas Anderson, but before that, I want to ask you, because I feel like it has a lot of the same themes. That's Sorrentino's La Grazia. It's about an aging Italian president. He's in the final months of his presidency, and he's wrestling with all kinds of moral dilemmas politically, but also very much so his relationship with his children, maybe particularly with his adult daughter, and what he's missed, and how they feel about him and his legacy. So also there is kind of the same themes.
Oh, totally. And a lot of the themes that we've been discussing are present. So, right. So La Grazia, as you described it, is the aging president. He's about to be done. He's looking back on his life and his career and his legacy, and he's very worried about it, but he kind of seems to know what to do, right? And he gives like good advice to like his successors or his staff on how to be a good president. And there's some political commentary there, right? But what's really much harder for him to solve is the relationship with his children. His son is the one who's totally absent and has rejected him, and just, something to do with him. The daughter's essentially his right hand, right? Like principal advisor, incredibly smart woman, by the way, like the one in Sentimental Value, but this aging man that feels like he both missed out on something, but also caused some harm with his emotional absenteeism. And in Sorrentino's world, it's sort of like he's living somewhere, I think, between Trier and Baumbach. He's like saying, well, I don't know exactly what the right balance was, but like this was a good man that like gave valuable things to the world. Whereas Jake Kelly, he's a superstar, so he's kind of like he's just a selfish, like, you know what I'm saying? Like Sorrentino's character, um, or the I always forget the actor's name, but he's the same Italian actor that's in a
Tony
lot of
Servillo,
Sorrentino's
yeah.
movies. Right. And so his character is is a value, it has positively contributed to his society. And so Sorrentino is, saying there's a cost to it, but some people have to pay it. And doesn't mean he doesn't love his children, and he does. And in fact, his daughter in a way becomes for him the one person that both gets him and he's he's a stubborn old man, et cetera, but she's the one that can get him to see things in a different way. Because she does ultimately, like, there's a whole moral conundrum at the center of the film that you think he's going to do. It's a little spoiler. You think he's going to do one thing, but because of her.
He's trying to reach out to his son, and he does that through art because his son is involved with music. And I
Right,
don't think he already always got that aspect of his son, but he's trying
right.
to sort of approach him through that.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely sort of an older generational perspective, that concept that they don't get the music
Yeah,
and the art,
exactly.
right? That's Sorrentino's older. So that's what's there, and that's obviously an element of fatherhood, maybe a little bit older generations. But yeah, that theme is totally there, and it's the old aging father who's anxious about what legacy. And it's also, I think, something we should say for in the Sorrentino movie, it's not just about what relationship they left with their children, but what legacy they've left for the world through their children, right? So that old school European, but perhaps also American concept of parenthood, which is I'm leaving something of myself, right? And so he's like, okay, did I leave good citizens? Did I leave good people? That is there, and
Yeah, the
again, it's
whole
perhaps
legacy question.
yeah, and perhaps because Sorrentino's older, the legacy question is much more present um, than in the other movies. They're a little more personal, as I mentioned.
That's a good way to get back into Paul Thomas Anderson and that sort of legacy question there, because that also feels like the relationship that Leonardo DiCaprio's character Bob has with his daughter is kind of leaving the revolution to the next generation, right? And what that means and what that implies for him.
Right. Right. So, and agreed. And one battle is probably the most complex in a good way of all of these that we're discussing. So it has a lot of the themes. Um, it definitely, to me, has one of the things that I mentioned, which was the move from the broad social commentary, which was what filmmakers were doing in the 70s, and Paul Thomas Anderson was still sort of doing in the 90s, um, and more the sort of introspection. And that transition is essentially, as you just said, plays itself out throughout the course of his life.
And
Yeah.
he's also really been dealing with older generation fathers and absent. I mean, from Magnolia and onward, there's always been bad fathers of the older generation. And this one, it feels like he's taking the role of looking at himself as a parent.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it's the most one of the reasons why it's the most complex one, right? Because this movie sort of lives along this spectrum. It also spans a broader timeline than some of the others. And well, I mean, that's not quite true, but it spans itself a broad, these are generational, intergenerational movies, right? So there's a lot of years embedded in some of the aspects of the story. And he's, I think it's a very good point. Like, he has some really bad fathers in his older movies. I think he wants to think of himself as a good, loving father. That's what he portrays. And maybe he's portraying himself as a father that doesn't always necessarily know what to do. And that, like, his daughter or daughters, as the case may be, are the ones who ultimately, save themselves, but it's the existence of his love that helps them get there. So I love that aspect of one battle after another. I think it's its strongest. It's very real, it's very emotional, and it's very persuasive in how it's presented in the movie. It also lives at the periphery of social commentary, right? Like, it's just right there. Um, you know, I mean, there's so much that's about today. There's immigration, and there's racism, and all power, gender power dynamics. There's all of those things are there. They're just sort of there, and he's sort of like right around it without like being that the focus of his movie at the end of the day is that fatherhood relationship.
And what does it mean to be a father? What does it mean to be the one who's there for your child? And how are you there?
Yeah. What does it mean to be there? And the totally different, a little bit like there's another movie, like it's a little bit Kramer versus Kramer. Like, we're back to that
Hmm.
where he's the father, the mother's not there. And that perspective is not entirely new, of course. I mentioned Kramer versus Kramer. I feel like there's another movie this year. It'll come to me. But what that means and how you do that and how you deal with that. And then, the answer is maybe a little simple, but again, very true and very well presented in this film, which is love. Love. And that answers your question. What does it mean to be the father? It's love, right? That's the answer. But like as straightforward and as cliche as that sounds, it's just not in the movie. Like it's very real. It's very persuasive.
Very much so.
Um, so that in a way is kind of like the bow on top, where he's answering a lot of these other questions that some of these filmmakers are posing or struggling with about like how much is too much, how much is too little. And like, certainly the father in One Battle After Another it's not like a perfect father, right? Like he smokes on a pot, he sits around, but overprotective, he's overprotective, etc. All of those things. But he's full of love and it's very real. And it's just kind of like, there you go. Like it's
Yeah,
pretty beautiful,
it really worked.
Yeah, it just
Yeah.
works.
What about a couple of fathers in genre films? Let's see. I'm thinking of the father element of Frankenstein and 28 Years Later. Some
Yeah,
thoughts.
or you also mentioned weapons, I think.
Yes, Weapons too.
Okay, so which one first? 28 days, 28 years
With
later, right?
years, yeah.
20 years later. Yeah. And remind me who's the actor? Like he's very well known. Sorry, I should have prepared that. But I saw the movie.
Yeah. No, I mean there you have a relationship between a father and a son where what they're dealing with there a lot is kind of toxic masculinity. The mother is ill and he has to prepare his son to go over to start fighting these
Yes.
zombies. And the dilemma here is very much that the son is not feeling that toxic masculinity and the whole
Yeah.
way the father wants is lying sort of about his prowess as the big warrior.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was just trying to remember, but it's Aaron Taylor Johnson, I
Yes.
remember.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, right. So that one is exactly that one is through themes of violence and gore, like like maybe Frankenstein and weapons, that's the sort of notion of rejecting fatherhood, right? So this is maybe still not rejecting fatherhood, rejecting sort of the lessons from your father. So this one goes back a little bit more into the category of um, the exploration of your father, not yourself as a father, I think.
Hmm.
Maybe, I think Frankenstein maybe has a little bit of both. But this movie, 28 years later, yeah, I think it's as you said, right? It's this the son doesn't want what the father wants and how that makes the father feel. And he thinks this is the right thing and to save him and to help him. And it's now the only world that he knows. So it's that sort of like intergenerational conflict of changing values and changing approaches and perspectives. But it's definitely a lot of toxic fatherhood.
Also, like the PTA, it has, the politics, Brexit. This society has gone back to nostalgia, and that means a very manly type of society where certain values are put to the forefront, which this son is rejecting, I would say.
Yeah. He's totally rejecting them. And the next one's coming out already, right? I feel like they did it.
Yeah,
So it'll be really interesting to
and that's Nia DaCosta, completely different director. It'll be interesting to see where they take it from there.
exactly. It'll be interesting to see how they sort of resolve that conflict of like the son is sort of rejecting this, but he's also good at it. So what does that mean? What do you do with that?
And in Frankenstein, of course, you have the father figure who rejects the son.
Yeah, I mean Frankenstein, and that is obviously a 200-year-old story. But Del Toro, who is so incredibly smart at like what he does, and not just the craft and the the visuals, but it's this complicated relationship, I think, because the father is rejecting the son, but the son is also sort of attacking the father, essentially, right? So he can be a source of destruction, and it's that is a very honest, and again, there's another movie in the motherhood example where it's just honest about the fact that like being a father and being a creator can be uh, destroy you or it can be bad for you. But in Frankenstein's case, it's because it was all the wrong reasons, right? He was playing God with the universe. He thought that he could create this monster or this, well, he didn't think of him as a monster, but he thought he could create something. And that sort of is the seed of his own destruction. And so I think maybe Del Toro is talking about the fatherhood, the legacy aspect of it. If you're not really doing it to love your children, maybe that's going to be bad for you, and that's going to be bad for the world, and obviously very bad for the child. So yeah, the movie's maybe not my favorite movie of the year,
No,
but
not mine either.
yeah. Well, some of the ones we've been talking about are just like, wow, I could see any of these like over and over again. This one's is visually striking. I think the theme is sort of like stumble a little bit. So you're like struggling to exactly understand where it's going with thematically. But it's a very compelling story that's very familiar to people, I think.
And you mentioned weapons, which I think is such an interesting. I mean, there you have all of the adult figures not being there for their children in certain ways. You have a community that's in trauma, very much allegory of addiction. This young child whose parents are suddenly changed, and he has to hide the fact and take care of them as a child of an addict in many cases has to do. And then you of course have the one father, the Josh Brolin character, and his son is a bully. You have all of these interesting parental figures in this movie, which
Yeah, I think, and right. And so because you think of like who's the good father in Weapons, presumably it's the Josh Brolin character, but as you say, he's like he's good in that he's trying to find these children where everyone else is failing, but he's raised this bully and he's not, the flashback show you he's not the best father. In fact, he's maybe the worst one.
Mhm.
So it's that's why it is, as you say, very complicated, very rich. For the main character, Alex, I think, his father figures are not there. And then there's this aunt who's like an aunt, and it just makes things a lot worse. Um,
Aunt
so
Gladys would not want to, you wouldn't want her in your family.
you wouldn't want her taking care of her kids. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's this, are the kids all right kind of anxiety in this movie, theme in this movie, right? About like adults just sort of screwing it up. And whereas Paul Thomas Anderson might have this sort of like neutral to hopeful vision of the future where it's like, well, we're going to pass this on to these new generations and these new generations are smart. Weapons might be a little more like, what have you done? Like, what have you done? And the children, obviously, it's a little spoilery, but they kind of have to save themselves ultimately.
Exactly.
Even though Brolin is like on the trail, like the kids have to save themselves. And so that's a big juxtaposition and sort of going back to the Paul Thomas Anderson thing, like this notion that what I think is really subtly there. Because again, as I said earlier, I think the movie sort of skirts at the periphery of like social commentary. I think it doesn't want to quite be super controversial. It doesn't want to piss off half the country. It doesn't want to do that, which is fine. It doesn't have to. But it has little subtle things, right? So like there's a scene where there's protests, but then like the cops send in someone to like make the protests worse. That worse, like that kind of that's a perspective, right? That's a political statement. And I think that the ultimate theme of the movie, which is that we can trust the younger generations to do better where we did not, is also a political statement because a lot of people that are very like deeply into politics today are like, well, it's the fault of millennials, it's the fault of Gen Z, it's the fault of, and he's rejecting that. He's saying, why don't we give them a chance, right? We've kind of screwed things up. We sat there and smoked pot. So that there's that hopeful,
Yeah, and the
um,
revolution did not work out, disbanded, and
but maybe the next generation could make things better, right? So that's a hopeful, and maybe there's a selfish legacy aspect in there too, which is like, well, we taught them, so there's my legacy. Is that like, and you could take a much more cynical understanding of that and say, oh, that's very easy for you. You wash your hands of your revolution, and you're like, oh, well, I made you this great daughter who's going to sell it for you. Well, you don't get the credit.
right.
You can take that cynical perspective of it, which is probably valid. There's probably something there. Back to weapons. In weapons, it's just, things are going to be very bad for the children. Things are going to be very, very bad for the next generation. The older generations have done all they can to suck the life out of them, have sucked the resources from the planet. They've sucked riches, right? And they're going to have to perhaps violently save themselves from the older generation, which it's a take, and it's certainly plausible as well, right? That there might have to be some violent uprising to destroy the body that is oppressing them, essentially. And the body that's oppressing them is this older generation that's just out for itself and that's been both neglectful of the future, but also now just trying to suck it out of the younger
Yeah, and
generation.
completely narcissistic and
Narcissistic,
sucking the life out of them. Yeah.
taking the life out of, yeah. So certainly very interesting perspective. And one side will be right. We won't know that for a little while.
We'll see. Should we move on to some mothers?
Let's do it. Which ones do you have in mind? I have a couple.
You and I talked, we had a really great conversation about Rose Byrne and If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, which I think we both really loved. I'm thinking of Die My Love. Why don't you talk about the women as these mothers as you see them?
Yeah, and it sounds like from the absence of Hamnet that you have it in the suffering one. But
Yes.
I might argue that Hamnet is about motherhood. So sorry to deviate a little, but
No,
like,
I please.
obviously Hamnet is about William Shakespeare, but it's really about her. It's about his wife and the difficulty of motherhood, the challenges of it, the harrowiness of it. And so I think what is going on in that, and so this woman, has these, I don't know if these are creative powers, artistic powers, witchcrafty power, whatever they are, right? It's some allegory for something. She's a very unique person that's sort of rejected by others, including her own family, for having some different aesthetic or sensibility. And she meets Shakespeare, and they form a family, and this has all sorts of other consequences in her life, including some really sad ones. And she is, despite the fact that everyone has always rejected her as a mother, a natural mother, she's an amazing mother. But one has to suffer through a lot. So I think to myself, and then Rose Byrne's character, right? So Rose Byrne is in the movie If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You. Really, really wonderful movie, I think.
Mm,
Like honestly, one of my favorites of the year so
me
far.
too.
Um, First of all, it's kind of like one battle, right? It's like it's just like
Relentless.
relentless, shot very well, very close up to her most of the time. Like not only is she like in almost every scene, but she's like this in almost every scene. And If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You is essentially about this woman who's a therapist and is dealing with a daughter who demands a lot of her time and attention because the daughter has an illness, but despite beyond that, right, a lot of things are just going wrongly in her life. So the director, I thought, said something really thoughtful about her own movie, which was that it's a movie about what happens when big picture things are going bad, but also little things are going bad, like someone took your parking spot, and like sort of how both of those kinds of challenges feel so big in their own way when they're happening. Um, and I thought it was a very honest movie about motherhood is difficult, and I don't have to love motherhood. I don't have to say that it's the best thing that ever happened to me. She's sort of rejecting the concept of like you're glowing in pregnancy, which is kind of like a stereotype for like, oh, a pregnant woman is the most beautiful thing in the world. She's saying, maybe it's not. Maybe it kind of really sucks. And she's twisting in a way, in a clever way, the whole take care of yourself to take care of your kids school of thought by saying, okay, well, I'm going to do that. And then she does some pretty, some things that most people would be like, oh, you're kind of maybe a bad mother. And so she's challenging all sorts of modernly accepted notions of motherhood, right? She's challenging this notion that taking care of yourself is the answer because, okay, well, let me take care of myself. Like, look at some of the things I could do to take care of myself. What do you think about that? And she's challenging the notion that another notion that you might hear as a parent that I'm sure I've said, which is like, oh, it's challenging, but like it's worth it because like here's all these good things. For her, it's like, nope, it kind of
Well,
sucks. Like it,
and how overwhelming it is, and that it's okay to somehow this movie is allowing for other mothers and parents in general to sort of say, yes, it is absolutely fucking overwhelming at
yeah.
times. What that does to her, and how she tries to manage this, which I think a lot of audience members get lost there because there's apparently a right way and a wrong way, and I think what's so interesting with this movie is it's not giving you that answer.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I love all the movies we've been just talking about for sure. But this movie I loved because, and it's so interesting. It's made by a woman about motherhood. All the ones we've been talking about so far have been made by men about fatherhood. And this one is so both brave. It's very brave to do some of the things it does because, as you say, you're going to lose some of the audience with this character that's doing things that most of us in a sober moment would say, maybe we shouldn't do that as parents, but she does it. And the movie's asking you to be sympathetic to this character that is going through a lot, but is doing some things that you're like, and so I just think it's brave. It's very, very thoughtful about, as you say, it's not always that easy. It's not always that great. And it's okay to say that, brave again. And then it's just like personal but universal because again, as you said, Christina, like this is something that happens to everyone or 99, I would assume 99% of people that have children, but a lot of us don't say it or don't want to talk about the dark part of it, the hard part of it. And so but she does in a, again, personal but universal way. And so rather than making about, you can really take a very cynical view on all these fatherhood movies and be like, oh God, here's the guys again, worried about their legacy and worried about where they stand in the world and worried about this. And this woman is just worried about like, how do I effing survive as a mother that exists in like in this very small, almost irrelevant part of the world where nothing grand is happening, nothing, no revolution and no intergenerational house and no big artist, none of that. Just like this mother that's dealing with her daughter and how to get through it and how to survive that. Like that's awesome, right? Like,
Nothing is expected from her husband either, who's absent during most of the film, but then he just like swoops in, fixes this thing in the apartment as if that was the only thing he could do.
was it that easy? Yeah.
Yeah, it's that easy somehow, but he's not there for any of the rest of it. And at the same time, she's devalued for what she's tried to do during that time that he's not there.
Exactly. Exactly. So she's complaining about that and it's like, yeah, she's being really cynical about like, oh, really, it's just that easy for you. But
Mhm.
that's because you don't understand everything else that's happening and in the many different ways in which this was challenging. And also it's easier for him because these men respond to the man, to the husband, and what he wants.
And she's also a working mother, not to forget. I mean, this is
Yeah,
not, she's juggling pretty much everything in this movie.
yeah. Yeah, she's a shrink, right? So like, yeah. So I mean, sorry for the light. I think that it's just, I think it's a wonderful movie that really exists within this universe that we're discussing of themes of parenthood, but that takes a totally different perspective and and as you said, one that the audiences are going to struggle to accept because nostalgia about,
And it's the same. I just want to mention Jennifer Lawrence in Die My Love, Lynn Ramsey's movie, which also deals with, you can see it as postpartum depression, but also a mother struggling, a woman struggling with the life she has to lead now as a mother and what she's going through, which I think is very interesting. And I'm wondering, these are, I think we both agree that they're kind of brave depictions of motherhood that we haven't seen all that much before. Why would you say that this is the moment for that? These are both female filmmakers that are talking about this, as well as Night Bitch was, which I didn't feel was quite as successful at all because didn't quite go to the levels that these are going, but it's still a female filmmaker looking into these issues of overwhelming motherhood.
yeah. So I mean, I agree with everything you said in terms of, and I have a theory to answer your question, but so Night Bitch is about these themes, but Night Bitch basically doesn't dare go all the way and say, it doesn't push it to where, and I read the book doesn't either. So it's very unsatisfying because it's setting up this brilliant setup and this great concept and you're like it's going to go there and it doesn't, whereas if I had like that kick you would, but obviously one movie might pave the way for the next one, right, in some ways. And I think that the reason we're seeing it is because we're maybe finally allowing women to like be a little more honest about it very slowly. I think audiences are still going to reject it. It's not like the movie's going to win Best Picture because it just can't, right? It's going to be divisive, and some people are going to say that woman is just a bad mom and shut up. And so the guardians of cultural sanctity will obviously want to destroy her. But I think that maybe, in a hopeful way, our society is a little more open and a little more thoughtful about like different perspectives. And I think that, it's come from pushes to so I guess what I'm saying is I think it's always been there, but I think the reason we're seeing it is because we're allowing them finally, and some people are finally being brave enough to sort of tell these stories, right? I think and it's a good sign. There's a lot of warning signs and bad signs for the future of art and creativity in this very complicated world that we live in, but I think that the existence of movies like this is a ray of hope because it suggests that we are creating spaces where just perspectives are respected with a little bit less value judgment. But I think it's always been there. I think we're just finally letting them through.
And also really high profile actresses who are taking on these brave
The
roles
risks also.
with the risk which as you said, many audience members may, frown upon the depictions of motherhood, they're still doing it. I mean, Rose Byrne is just raw in this movie.
Yeah,
It's a risk, and she's doing it.
totally.
And I'm
And
sure her and Jennifer Lawrence named are of course adding to them getting being able to get money for these movies.
I think right. I think it's thought, and so maybe Paul Thomas Anderson is right. Maybe the newer generations will, push us a little further, the arc of history or whatever. I think this is a little off topic, but when you said the risk the actors are taking, I remember thinking to myself at some point during the festival season that like there's so many like heartthrob leading actors playing gay men that's also something new. We didn't see that before. Like in the Tom Cruise generation, the Brokeback Mountain generation, like there was no Brad Pitt played a gay man, right? Like making out with another man and like having sex with them. Like that was not, you had niche people are actually gay actors playing. And so it's just funny to me that like now you have like Josh O'Connell and like Paul Mescal, like things like that. Alexander Skarsgård
Skarsgård.
in another movie. Yeah, like so people more willing to sort of take those risks. But it's a complicated. I mean, let's talk about Me Too. My God, let's talk about Oscar So White. This is like the most complicated thing you could ever discuss. They can only take the risk so far as the audiences are like it's very complicated, right?
Hmm.
Because they can take the risk and then the whole world could say like this movie sucks or you should have never played this character and it wouldn't work. So it's a symbiotic relationship, right? Between audiences more willing, studio people more willing, and the actors and the creative filmmakers. So but it's working and it's getting there, and that's exciting, right? Because 5, 10 years from now, we could have even more. And I hope we all agree that it's just great to have these like diversity of perspectives on parenthood. Like
It
it's
is.
it's so stimulating. So we might not agree with each of these. We might be like, oh, that one kind of sucks. Like that parent kind of sucks. That's okay. That's part of the point.
Yeah, and that's part of life, isn't it? I mean, we're all
Yeah.
parent differently, and all
Yeah.
these perspectives are what's so interesting. Um,
Exactly.
I just want to mention, and we're talking about Hamnet, also has that other theme we were talking about in sort of finding each other through art. I think also has to do with Chloe Zhao and why these directors want to tell these stories that they're very connected to. That somehow through art you can find love and connection and
And I think you're right. And I think it's also about like dealing with grief and loss through art, right? Again, an age-old theme, not anything particularly new, but that's there for her. And I think we haven't really talked about awards. What I think is really interesting is that there's all these films about fatherhood and we're in like the post-Me Too world, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, it looks like the film made by a guy about fathers is going to sort of beat the one about a woman, beat a mother made by a woman. So that remains really fascinating to me in that it seems like at the end of the day, for whatever reason, even though we're accepting and more open to sort of different perspectives, audiences are much more accustomed to sort of connecting with male focused stories, or you might just turn around and say, no, Jorge, it's just a better movie. Fine. I mean, you could say that, and maybe it is, right? Like, I don't know objectively, how can one decide which of those two movies is better? But maybe someone else can. From my perspective, it's this sort of like, you go back to movies like last year where Nora, and it's about a girl, but it's really being told by a man's perspective. It's like the audience is so used to that perspective that there must be, in my mind, some element of coalescing around those films because they can speak to both the men and the women essentially in the group. Whereas these films, Hamnet, if I had legs, men are just not going to connect with them for better or for worse. That's my theory. And again, I could be wrong, but this is theory.
no, I mean it feels like from my perspective that we've moved a little bit forward in the sense that they're in the conversation. People are seeing them and I mean I'm pretty sure Jessie Buckley will,
Do really well, yeah.
would possibly win for this one and but yeah, I mean I guess we have to, as we do in so many areas in concerning women and other marginalized groups, everything moves slowly, but you're happy for a little bit, the needle moving just a tad, right?
Yeah, so the only one I'll mention that there's a lot of movies about parenthood that I saw in the festivals this year, but I will mention Bad Apples, with the Saoirse Ronan movie.
Yes.
And it's going to be a BFI. I don't know if it has an audience release date. It seems like maybe it doesn't, but it's basically she's a teacher, and the kids are really, really problematic. But there's a particular one who's a really bad apple. And essentially the plot of the movie is that the kid disappears for whatever reason, and things start going really well for all the other kids because the bad apple's out. And it's kind of a parody about sort of selfish parenthood and parents that are like also making some really interesting decisions just to like make to protect their own kids. And so I think that movie is pushing back on that modern notion of parenthood. That's like my kid, my kid, my kid, like that sort of like whatever my kid wants and whatever my kid needs, I'll do anything. And so it's existent. She is just a teacher. She is not herself a parent. So she's having this like really interesting, really interesting interaction with these parents where she's like, well, we all want the kids to be better now that this bad apple is gone, but like, what about this kid? What do we do with this kid? So and she's like, she's seeing that these parents can become pretty awful people when it comes to like protecting their old child. So it fits somewhere in this conversation we're
Interesting.
having.
Yeah.
It was really, really good. And Saoirse, of course, is good as she usually is. It's a little bit of a parody, because, well, or maybe a black comedy. But I would put that on people's radar as one of the other like parenthood movies from the season so far.
Yes. And Weapons also has that element of a teacher and parents who are, ostracize her and give her all the blame
Exactly.
because she was the last one to think, while they themselves are sort of stepping back.
That's why I thought about it. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one. I mean, this one's came out at Sundance, but like Train Dreams, like Train Dreams that's a beautiful movie about fatherhood and a lot of similar, was I a good father? Was I absent? And pain. This one lives with Hamnet a little bit. This one lives with one battle. I highly recommend that one. I think is it Joel Edgerton is probably going to get an Oscar nomination. It's a very, very beautiful movie about technological change and all sorts of other things, but it's really about parenthood and fatherhood, and it's just really, really worth it. So I recommend that one. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's the only other one that I would think of.
Well, this was so great. We'll see what this leads to. More explorations into the theme will be interesting.
I think it will. I didn't make a list of last year, but as you and I discussed in Telluride, in the last couple, I mean, I became a dad in 2022. And I felt like either at the 23 or 24 Film Festival, I was like, this theme is here. And my husband was like, no, you're just noticing it because now you're a dad. But I went back, I think it's building. So
Oh, me too.
I
Yeah.
think it's building. I think we're going to see more of it. And I'm very excited to see where it takes us.
Thank you so much. Or could tell everyone where they can read all your reviews and what's going on.
Oh, totally. So on Instagram, I'm at awards_predicts, and I write freelance for websites that and I think you work with too, Christina, Awards Watch, Next Best Picture, latinamedia.com.co actually, published some of my things. So thank you so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed it.
It was great. Thank you so much.
See ya.
Thank you so much for joining us. Pop Culture Confidential is a part of the Evergreen Podcast Network, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.